Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take the world's most dense narratives and critical sources and distill them down to the essential, conversation-starting knowledge you need.
Today, we are conducting a deep and I think really necessary dive into the life, work, and absolutely critical contributions of Chinua Achebe.
And when we say critical, we mean it. We're talking about a figure who didn't just join the global literary scene. He fundamentally demanded that the global literary scene change its perspective or risk total irrelevance.
Born Albert Chinomoko in 1930, he really does stand as this central, almost monumental figure of modern African literature. A novelist, poet, and a completely uncompromising critic who, successfully reclaimed the narrative of a continent.
Okay, let's unpack this mission because it really was monumental. Achebe's writing was never just about telling a good story. It was a necessary effort to provide a counter-narrative.
A response, really.
A direct response to the decades, maybe even centuries, of racist, simplistic, and often just dehumanizing Western depictions of Africa. And the sources we've examined confirm his success, especially through his magnum opus, Things Fall Apart, published in 1958.
And that success it's just staggering. I mean, you look at the numbers and they're hard to comprehend. Things Fall Apart remains the most widely studied, the most translated.
In how many languages?
57 languages. And it's the most read African novel with over 20 million copies sold worldwide. It sets the standard.
And that novel formed the foundation of what literary circles call his early African trilogy.
Right, which also included the follow-up, No Longer at Ease in 1960, and then Arrow of God in 1964. Each one sort of builds on the last, tracking this cultural collision through generations.
Now, here's where we get into the nuanced, critical details right away. And I think this sets the tone for Achebe's entire career. Despite this undeniable influence, despite basically establishing a literary canon where none was recognized before, he famously and vigorously rejected a title that many critics gave him.
The father of modern African literature.
Exactly. Why did he hate that so much? It sounds like the ultimate compliment.
Well, what's fascinating here is that his rejection wasn't driven by any kind of false humility. It was driven by pure intellectual rigor. He saw that label as intensely Eurocentric.
Eurocentric? How so?
He argued it demonstrated a fundamental lack of education on the part of the critics who were, pontificating about it.
So he was saying that by calling him the father, they were implying that African literature was only born when he decided to write in English.
Precisely. That it just sort of sprang into existence in 1958.
Erasing everything that came before.
Everything. To accept the title of father would be to erase centuries of complex African oral and written traditions that existed long, long before the colonial period. Achebe felt those traditions were the true ancestors of his work, not some arbitrary starting line defined by a Western publisher. And this pushback against intellectual erasure is absolutely key to understanding everything he wrote.
So our mission today, for you, the listener, and for us, is to explore the sources that reveal precisely how Achebe built this legacy while simultaneously fighting that kind of erasure. We're digging deep into the intellectual forces that shaped him.
That's right. We're looking at the crossroads of Igbo tradition and colonial Christianity, his very controversial political engagement, especially during the Biafran War, and his profound literary criticism that didn't just critique the canon.
No, it fundamentally shifted global academic perspectives. Forever. To really understand the man who dared to rewrite the map, we absolutely have to start with his foundation. And that foundation was laid at a pivotal, I'd say uncomfortable, and highly stimulating intersection of cultures.
It really was. So let's talk about his early life in Ogidi, colonial Nigeria, from his birth in 1930 up through his university years in the early 1950s.
This environment was, in a way, the central conflict of his first novels, just made real.
Oh, completely. Achebe was born into a family that stood directly at this crossroads of deep, traditional Igbo culture and the pervasive, ambitious influence of colonial Christianity. It was a household of constant negotiation.
The family structure is so crucial here because it shows the division wasn't just out there in the village, it was at his own dinner table.
Exactly. His father, Isaiah Okafo Achebe, was a teacher and an evangelist. He was an early convert to the Protestant Church Mission Society, the CMS. And his mother, Janet Eneneki Elogburnam, was highly respected, a leader among the churchwomen and also the daughter of a prominent blacksmith from Akka. They were committed to this new Christian faith.
Yet, and this is the key, Achebe wasn't raised in a vacuum sealed off from tradition.
Not at all. Our sources point out that while his father Isaiah stopped practicing Odinani, the ancestral religious practices, he still maintained this profound respect for those traditions.
And that respect was embodied by someone very close to them, right?
Yes, his influential uncle, Chief Udo Osinye, he was a titled Ojidi leader who completely refused to convert to the new faith. So Chinua grew up watching this intellectual tension, but also this respect between these two worlds. He saw the complexity inherent in change, rather than some simplistic good versus evil battle.
And this dual influence wasn't just theological. It was deeply cultural. It was foundational to his narrative voice. And it was nurtured by storytelling.
Oh, storytelling was everything. The sources stress that storytelling was the mainstay of the Igbo tradition. It was their historical archive, their moral compass, their entertainment. His formal education was constantly being supplemented by these rich narratives shared, often at night, by his mother and his older sister, Zenobia.
So he was just absorbing this material constantly.
Like a sponge. He eagerly anticipated traditional village events, especially the complex masquerade ceremonies. These weren't just folklore he read about in a book. They were sensory, embodied cultural events. You had the sound of the drums, the visual complexity of the masks, the entire community coming together.
Experiences he would later recreate so vividly.
And accurately. He preserved it, documented it, and gave it immense dignity in written form for a global audience that had never seen anything like it.
He was clearly academically gifted. He excelled in both primary and secondary school, and his academic prowess led him directly to Nigeria's first university.
University College, now the University of Ibadan, when it opened in 1948. He arrived initially with a prestigious bursary, a scholarship, to study medicine.
That was the ticket, right? The route to a highly respectable, stable career.
The golden ticket. But that path was fundamentally rerouted by a single event, which he himself referred to as the literary wake-up call.
What was that?
While studying, he became, in his words, fiercely critical of how Western literature, specifically those colonial adventure novels, portrayed Africa. This wasn't just a critical reading, it was the spark of his life's work. He realized that the books that supposedly defined Africa for the rest of the world were fundamentally insulting and, frankly, based on pure ignorance.
And there was a specific catalyst, one book that really pushed him over the edge.
Yes, Joyce Carey's novel, Mr. Johnson. Now, this book won critical acclaim in the West for its portrayal of what they called a happy-go-lucky African clerk. But Achebe was just incensed by it.
What was it about that portrayal that angered him so deeply?
It was the complete dehumanization inherent in the characterization. Johnson was portrayed as childlike, a simple figure completely lacking in any kind of complex internal life or intellectual depth.
A caricature.
A total caricature. Achebe read it and instantly recognized his profound dislike for the African protagonist, and he realized that this dislike wasn't a failure of the character, but a failure of the author. Carey portrayed Nigerians as either savages or buffoons. That moment solidified Achebe's conviction. He had to stop preparing to be a doctor who healed bodies and start becoming a writer who healed the cultural soul.
That decision to abandon medicine must have been incredibly costly, literally and figuratively.
Oh, it was a massive financial blow. He lost his scholarship. This required his family, who were not wealthy by any means, to make significant sacrifices to keep him in school.
What kind of sacrifices?
To continue his studies in English, history, and theology, the subjects he now knew were necessary for his mission, his older brother, Augustine, who was a civil servant, gave up the money he had set aside for a trip home.
Wow.
It was a profound communal investment. It wasn't just Chinua changing careers. His family was betting on his ability to succeed in this difficult, newly forged literary path. That kind of pressure. It's immense.
That deep personal and financial cost really underscores the seriousness of his commitment. Even during his time at Ibadan, his earliest publications in the University Herald, which he edited for a time, they already foreshadow the themes of his masterpieces.
They absolutely did. You can see it all there in embryonic form. He wrote essays exploring philosophy and freedom in academia, but he specifically focused on the synthesis and the resulting conflicts between rural Nigerian life and Christian institutions.
That same tension he saw between his father and his uncle.
Exactly. You can see the thematic genesis of things fall apart right there in those student essays. He was setting the intellectual stage for his life's work, examining that precise conflict between tradition and modernity, even before he had a publisher.
So after graduation in 1953, Achebe spends this brief but critically revealing 4 months teaching at the Merchants of Light School in Obadana.
Which the sources describe as a a pretty ramshackle institution. It was built rather inauspiciously on what the locals called a bad bush.
But even there, he was already imposing his worldview. He was urging his students to read extensively and, most importantly, to prioritize originality above all else.
That brief teaching stint was a kind of coda to his academic life. But then came the crucial pivot in 1954. He moves to Lagos to work for the Nigerian Broadcasting Service, the NBS.
In the talks department.
Yeah.
And this was the ultimate practical writing education for him.
It was absolutely vital for shaping his narrative voice and especially his mastery of dialogue. Preparing scripts meant he was constantly working with language intended for the ear, not just for the eye.
That's a great point. You have to write it so it can be spoken naturally.
And that forced him to master the nuanced differences between formal written language and natural, rhythmic, spoken Igbo oratory translated into English. This ability to make the dialogue feel authentic, alive, and rooted in an oral tradition, which became the hallmark of his fiction, was a direct result of his time mastering the airwaves.
And it was during this intensive period in Lagos that he finally began work on his first novel. Which brings us to the great, terrifying near disaster that almost deprived world literature of Things Fall Apart.
The story of the manuscript is, it's almost as dramatic as the novel itself. In 1956, he's on a staff training trip to the BBC in London, and he shows the manuscript to a novelist named Gilbert Phelps.
And Phelps liked it.
He was enthusiastic, yes. But Achebe, ever the meticulous craftsman, insisted it needed more work before submission. He was determined not to rush it.
But the real danger arrived in 1957, once the writing was complete. What did he do that put his entire literary future at risk?
He sent his only handwritten copy.
His only copy?
His only one. Along with a significant £22 fee, which was a hefty sum for a young Nigerian writer at the time, to a typing service in London that he found advertised in the Spectator magazine.
Oh, no.
He had no other copy, and after months passed with no reply, no typed pages, and no return of the original manuscript, he feared the worst. He thought it was lost forever.
I can't even imagine the despair. This is years of work, his entire intellectual and financial investment just gone. How on earth did the manuscript get saved?
It was pure luck and sheer righteous anger. His boss at the NBS, a sympathetic and very assertive Englishwoman named Angela Beattie, was traveling to London.
And he told her what happened.
He did, and when she heard, she marched directly into that typing service office. The sources describe her just angrily demanding to know why Achebe's manuscript, this precious document, was just lying ignored in a corner. She demanded they send a typed copy to him immediately.
It's astounding.
Yeah.
A single, furious intervention from a boss literally saved his debut.
It absolutely did. Achebe himself later credited her with saving his career. He stated that if the novel had been lost at that point, he likely would have been so discouraged that he would have given up writing altogether.
Wow. It's chilling to think how close we came to losing this foundational work of modern literature just due to the bureaucratic inefficiency of a London typing pool.
It really is. And even when he finally submitted the typed manuscript, some publishing houses still rejected it.
On what grounds?
They cited the classic colonial-era marketing ignorance, that fiction from African writers had no market potential. They just believed there was no interest, either domestically or internationally, for stories told from an indigenous African perspective. They were fundamentally wrong.
But the executives at Heinemann eventually took a chance. What was it that finally swayed them?
It was largely thanks to one man, an educational advisor named Donald McRae. He read the submission, and his reaction was immediate and definitive. He reported back to Heinemann, "This is the best novel I have read since the war."
Since the war, that's a huge statement.
That was the green light. They published 2,000 hardcover copies on June 17, 1958.
And the title itself, Things Fall Apart, taken from W.B. Yeats's apocalyptic poem, The Second Coming, just perfectly captured the internal cultural rupture he was documenting.
It's a perfect title.
Initial reception was strong in the UK. The Times Literary Supplement praised its success in genuinely presenting tribal life from the inside. But what about at home? Was the reception in Nigeria universally celebratory?
No, not initially. It was mixed, actually. The sources note that the faculty at the University of Ibadan, where Achebe had just graduated, found the very idea of a worthwhile novel written by an alumnus amusing.
Amusing.
Yes. They were so entrenched in the idea that serious literature had to come from Europe that they initially dismissed the idea of an African literary masterpiece being born in their own classrooms. But others, of course, recognized its vivid and undeniable picture of Igbo life and praised it profoundly.
Despite those mixed academic reviews at home, Achebe was already pressing forward. He quickly completed his early trilogy, moving the discussion forward in time. No Longer at Ease comes out in 1960.
And with that one, he shifts the focus from the initial collision with colonialism to the internal corrosion of post-colonial life.
How does he do that?
He literally follows the family line. No Longer at Ease shifts the focus to Obi Okonkwo, who is the grandson of the original protagonist, Okonkwo. It's set in modern Lagos, where Obi is a highly educated civil servant.
And the conflict is different.
Very different. The novel is a stark exploration of how the post-colonial state, supposedly free, still traps and corrupts its educated elite. Obi struggles with the crippling pressures of tradition, modernization, and especially corruption. He ultimately accepts a bribe and falls from grace.
So Achebe's showing that the clash wasn't simply between black and white anymore.
Exactly. It was now between traditional integrity and the moral decay of modern Nigerian society itself.
And the third novel in the trilogy, Arrow of God from 1964, returns to the rural setting but deepens that conflict.
It does. Arrow of God is thematically richer, I think. It's focused on a Zulu, the chief priest of several villages, who pits his own spiritual authority against the encroaching British colonial administration.
And it doesn't end well for him.
No. A Zulu's refusal to cooperate with the colonial government, even when it might save his community, ends up being a tragic act of hubris that destroys the very traditions he swore to protect. The novel demonstrates that internal conflict and pride are often just as destructive as any external colonial pressure.
While writing these foundational works, he was also traveling. In 1960, he received a Rockefeller Fellowship. And his travel experiences, they really reveal the ongoing absurdity of global colonial structures, even as nations were achieving independence.
Oh, those anecdotes are so telling. When he traveled to East Africa, Kenya, Tanganyika, Zanzibar, he was forced to fill out an immigration form that asked him to check a box indicating his ethnicity.
What were the options?
The only options were European, Asiatic, Arab, or other. To be forced to check other was just deeply dismaying. It's categorizing the citizen of a newly independent nation as a non-entity.
And that frustration translated into active defiance in other places, didn't it?
Absolutely. When he was in northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia, he explicitly defied segregation policies on a bus to Victoria Falls. He simply sat in the whites-only section despite the driver's protest.
What happened?
He was cheered on by the black passengers who were forced to sit behind the line. These were small but powerful acts of rebellion that fueled his global vision of demanding respect.
Upon his return in 1961, he gets promoted to Director of External Broadcasting, helping establish the Voice of Nigeria, VODEN, which launched in 1962. But his greatest literary legacy, outside of his own writing, was still to come.
This is where he shifted from being a single great writer to a literary galvanizer. He attended a writers' conference in Uganda, where he read a novel by a then-student named James Ngugi,
who later became the globally recognized Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
The very same. The novel was Weep Not, Child. Achebe was so impressed by the student's talent and vision that he immediately recommended it to Heinemann, his own publisher.
And he did this for other writers, too.
He did the same for the work of Flora Nwapa, who became the first female African writer published in this new series. Heinemann recognized Achebe's impeccable eye for talent and appointed him as the general editor of the Heinemann African Writers series.
That series, under Achebe's guidance, it was transformative, wasn't it? It essentially formalized the entire field of post-colonial African literature.
It absolutely was. By curating, editing, and promoting works from across the entire continent, writers from Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, and beyond, he galvanized the careers of countless post-colonial African writers. But more importantly, it fostered the growth of a global discourse on African literature. It established the field as a serious academic area, not just some niche curiosity. He gave the world the library it needed to finally understand Africa on its own terms.
If we move now to Achebe's literary style, we see how he didn't just write stories about Africa. He fundamentally wrote in an African way. His fiction style, particularly in the rural novels, relies so heavily on the Igbo oral tradition.
That oral tradition is the structural, the rhythmic, and the moral DNA of his writing. It's not just window dressing. He deliberately incorporates folk tales, using them as subtle yet powerful expositors of community values. They don't just entertain. They define the acceptable boundaries of behavior.
How does he use those tales to expose morality, particularly in Things Fall Apart?
Okay, take the tale of Earth and Sky, which he includes in the novel. It's a very specific parable that's used to emphasize the essential interdependency of the masculine and the feminine principles in the natural and spiritual world. The tale teaches balance.
But the protagonist, Okonkwo, who is obsessed with appearing masculine and strong.
He actively dislikes hearing this tale. Scholars point to this small detail, Okonkwo's aversion to a story about complementarity, as subtle evidence that his internal moral compass is already unbalanced and pointed toward eventual ruin. It's brilliant foreshadowing.
And then there are the proverbs, which he used not merely as cultural flair, but as functional narrative tools.
He famously said that proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten.
What a great phrase.
Isn't it? He deployed them as the concentrated, inherited wisdom of the rural Igbo tradition. He didn't just sprinkle them in for flavor. He integrated them so deeply into the narrative that they created what critics call an echo effect of community judgment.
So when a character speaks in a proverb, it's a kind of shorthand.
It's a shorthand way of invoking the collective, inherited wisdom of the community to either support or condemn a position. If you can speak in Proverbs accurately, you show that you are deeply integrated into the community's moral structure.
And this technique is more pronounced in some books than others.
Precisely. It's most explicit in a novel like Arrow of God, where the constant use of Proverbs reinforces the collective values and community judgment upon the chief priest, Azulu. But it's notably less pronounced in his later, more urban novels, like No Longer at Ease or A Man of the People.
Why is that?
Because the social structure of modern Nigerian cities is far less communal and much more individualized. It reflects a loss of that shared oral tradition. The Proverbs don't have the same currency.
Let's pivot to what was perhaps Achebe's most crucial and controversial stylistic choice during the 1950s and 60s. His decision to use the colonizers' language, English.
This was a huge point of contention among African writers at the time. Some, like Nugirwa Thiamo later would, advocated writing only in indigenous languages.
But Achebe's defense was brilliant and really very pragmatic.
It was. He argued that colonialism, despite all its monstrous ills, unintentionally provided colonized people with a profoundly useful tool, a language with which to talk to one another.
So it became a unifying tool in a highly diverse country like Nigeria.
Absolutely. In a country with such linguistic complexity, English became, as he put it, the one central language enjoying nationwide currency. It allowed him to reach a broad Nigerian audience that might otherwise be segregated by dozens of different indigenous languages.
And it had a strategic advantage globally.
Yes, strategically, using English ensured his books were read in the colonial ruling nations, Britain and the West, the very audience that needed to hear this counter-narrative most desperately. It forced them into a critical dialogue.
But the concern, which he acknowledged, was that by using the master's tools, he risked legitimizing or being trapped by the cultural baggage of that language. How did he push back against the limits of English itself?
He was not a passive recipient of the language. He was a conqueror of it. He aimed to push back the limits of English to fully accommodate African thought patterns. He didn't do this through innocence or poor grammar, but through absolute mastery.
You transformed it.
He transformed it into a distinctly African style by altering its syntax, its usage, and its idiom. He would translate Igbo speech patterns, which might structure a sentence in a certain way, or use repetition and cadence characteristic of oral speech directly into the English.
So it sounds different.
It sounds different. It feels different on the page. He made English carry the weight of Igbo metaphysics and rhythm. He essentially indigenized the colonial language, transforming it into a vehicle for African expression. He made it clear that mastery was the only way to extend the language's frontiers.
Let's transition now to the core of his message, the enduring themes of his work. His central focus is always on that intersection of African tradition, specifically Igbo varieties and modernity, which is largely embodied by European colonialism.
The foundational theme is the sheer violence and rupture caused by that collision. Achebe didn't romanticize the past, but he made it crystal clear that the colonial experience, particularly the introduction of divisive Christianity, was what he called the systematic emasculation of the entire culture.
That's such a powerful phrase.
The arrival of the missionaries and the colonial government created these internal divisions in Umuofia that the society simply could not withstand.
And as we discussed with the trilogy, he showed that this tension didn't just magically resolve with independence, it mutated.
It mutated into the post-colonial crisis. The initial cultural wound remains, but now it manifests as internal corruption. Obi Okonkwo's ethical fall in Lagos in No Longer at Ease.
Or Odili Somelu's moral descent into luxury and hedonism in A Man of the People.
They're symbols of the wider crisis in newly independent African states. These novels diagnose the problem, a governing elite that adopted the elitism and corruption of the colonizers, thereby betraying the hope of independence.
And he felt the African writer had a specific role in this.
A duty, even, to build a narrative of redemption against this cultural and political denigration, one rooted in a deep historical consciousness and moral clarity.
One of the most intellectually compelling aspects of his work is that he always rejected simple dualities. His work is not about choosing tradition over modernity or condemning everything Western. He famously rejected moral absolutes.
That philosophical position is the intellectual key to Achebe. He stated very clearly in 1972, "No single truth satisfied me. No single man can be correct all the time. No single idea can be totally correct."
That's a very challenging idea for a lot of people to accept.
It is. His entire worldview, which is deeply rooted in the Igbo ethos, demanded balance and, most importantly, complementarity.
What exactly does he mean by complementarity, and why did he see its opposite extremism as the mortal sin?
Complementarity is the idea that two opposing or seemingly contradictory forces are necessary to create a complete, stable whole. In the Igbo worldview she admired, balance between male and female, spirit and material, tradition and change is absolutely necessary for societal stability.
And he puts this philosophy right into the mouths of his characters.
Most beautifully, I think, through Ikem, a character in his later novel, *And Hills of the Savannah. Ikem stresses that whatever you are is never enough. You must find a way to accept something from the other to make you whole and to save you from the mortal sin of righteousness and extremism.
The mortal sin of righteousness and extremism, that statement carries immense weight. It suggests that absolute certainty is inherently dangerous.
It is, and this focus on necessary balance brings us directly to one of the most persistent critical debates surrounding his most famous work, the masculinity and femininity balance.
Right. Achebe absolutely faced criticism regarding his depiction of traditionally patriarchal Igbo society. Critics noted the polygamy, the frequent, often brutal beating of wives, the general dominance of masculine values.
But Achebe himself fiercely insisted that things fall apart is fundamentally on the side of women.
So how can a novel that depicts a patriarchal, often violent society be fundamentally on the side of women?
Because the story is a profound condemnation of patriarchy taken to a destructive extreme. Scholars and Achebe himself confirm that Okonkwo's downfall is not an accident of fate or merely the result of colonial intrusion. His destruction is the direct, spiritual, and cultural consequence of his offenses against the feminine principle.
His fear of weakness.
His obsessive fear of weakness, which he equates with femaleness, manifests in his abusive treatment of his wives, his constant worry that his son Awai isn't manly enough, and his deep regret that his intelligent, brave daughter Azinma was not born a boy.
So his failure is not merely a personal flaw. It's a systematic ideological crime against the necessary balance of his own culture.
Precisely. His inability to honor the feminine principle is a failure to honor the earth goddess, Ayuni, who represents morality and fertility. And when he is exiled after his gun accidentally explodes and kills a boy, he is sent to his mother's village.
Not his father's, his mother's.
A place where he encounters the profound redemptive concept of Nika.
Let's focus on Nika. What does that principle translate to, and why is it so significant that Okonkwo learns this lesson only in exile when it's too late?
Nika translates to "Mother is supreme." It's an extended discussion in the novel that reaffirms the profound foundational value of the feminine ethos in Igbo society. When a man is defeated, when he is in danger, when he needs absolute refuge, he turns to his mother's people because mother is supreme.
And Okonkwo's defeat is the ultimate proof of this principle.
It's seen as a vindication of the need for this balancing ethos. His violent anti-women position is characterized as the exception and the source of his ruin in Umufia, a society that demands balance and respect for complementarity. Achebe was famously frustrated by being misunderstood on this, stating he wanted to sort of scream that things fall apart is on the side of women and that Okonkwo is paying the penalty for his treatment of women.
Achebe's profound focus on cultural and political balance was tested dramatically in the mid-1960s. This was a period where his role expanded dramatically beyond that of just a novelist. He stepped into the roles of prophet, diplomat, and ultimately one of the world's most influential literary critics.
The transition to prophet is almost impossibly literal. His fourth novel, A Man of the People, which was published in 1966, was this bleak, funny, but ultimately damning satire of a newly independent African state facing staggering systemic corruption.
They're focused on a teacher, right?
Yes, a morally upright schoolteacher opposing a comically corrupt minister of culture. And the events that followed its publication sound like something out of a fictional thriller.
I've heard this story. His friend, the poet John Pepper Clark, read an advance copy.
And upon finishing it, he famously declared, "Chinua, I know you are a prophet. Everything in this book has happened except a military coup."
He found the political corruption so spot on, the only thing missing was the inevitable collapse of the state.
And then almost immediately afterward.
Within weeks of its publication, the 1966 Nigerian coup d'etat occurred.
Exactly. This political violence and change of regime, precisely predicted by the trajectory of corruption he had described, put Achebe under immense suspicion by the Nigerian armed forces. They genuinely suspected he had foreknowledge of the events, which was absurd, but it spoke to how acutely he had observed the rot in the political system.
And this political turbulence quickly intensified into open warfare with the devastating Nigeria-Biafran War from 1967 to 1970.
The southeastern region seceded, and Achebe became a fiercely committed supporter of Biafran independence. His role shifted entirely from novelist to diplomat and ambassador. He was all in.
The war dictated his creative output, I imagine.
Completely. Due to the chaos, the constant threat, and the eventual bombing and destruction of his family home, he couldn't possibly focus on long, complex novels. Instead, he channeled his energy into shorter, more intense formats.
Mostly poetry.
Primarily poetry, which was collected later in Beware, Soul Brother. His famous poem, Refugee, Mother and Child, became this poignant international image of the horrific suffering that was surrounding him.
He also became an outspoken ambassador, traveling to Europe and North America to promote the Biafran cause and argue for international recognition.
He made some very specific, politically charged choices during this time, choices that confirmed his priorities lay with his people, not with his career. He refused a highly desirable academic invitation from the U.S., choosing instead to involve himself directly in drafting the principles of the Biafran Revolution, also known as the Ahira Declaration.
He was dedicating his intellectual power to nation building, even in the midst of its collapse.
That's right. And this dedication came at a steep personal cost after Biafra's eventual end in 1970.
How so?
The Nigerian government, which viewed him as a secessionist sympathizer, revoked his passport. This severely limited his ability to travel and conduct his academic work for a time. He was politically exposed and professionally hampered, but his commitment never wavered.
But it was a few years later, in 1975, while teaching abroad at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, that he truly dropped the literary bombshell that changed post-colonial studies forever.
This was An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which he delivered as a chancellor's lecture. This was the landmark moment of critical discourse. He didn't just critique Joseph Conrad's novel. He decried Conrad himself as a thoroughgoing racist.
Why was that accusation so incendiary at the time? I mean, Conrad's novel was typically praised as a critique of European imperialism.
Because Achebe argued that Conrad's critique was superficial and ultimately failed because it dehumanized the very people suffering under that imperialism. Achebe's specific criticism was that Conrad's novel renders Africa merely as a metaphysical battlefield devoid of all recognizable humanity, into which the wandering European enters at his peril.
The African people exist only as part of the landscape.
As noise, as shadows, or as primitive threats. Never as complex, fully realized human beings with their own history and interior life.
And he wasn't just criticizing a long-dead novelist either. He took aim at contemporary figures who were widely celebrated.
That's right. He critiqued the Nobel laureate Albert Schweitzer, who ran a mission hospital in Gabon, and famously said, "The African is indeed my brother, but my junior brother."
Oof.
Achebe pointed out that Schweitzer's paternalistic attitude was reflected in the facilities he built, a hospital built for junior brothers that had shockingly inadequate hygiene standards, even for the time. It was reminiscent of pre-germ theory medical practice. It showed the direct, tangible cost of racist condescension.
I can imagine the initial backlash from the academic establishment was immediate and fierce.
Oh, absolutely. The sources note that many tenured English professors were genuinely upset. One elderly professor reportedly approached him and simply stormed away after saying, "How dare you?"
And the tide quickly turned.
It did. Achebe's criticism was just too meticulously argued and too morally necessary to ignore. The critic Nicholas Trudell divides all criticism of Conrad into two epical phases, before and after Achebe.
And what was the lasting legacy of that essay?
It fundamentally shifted the ground beneath literary criticism. His perspective became so mainstream that the essay was later included in the Norton Critical edition of Conrad's novel, ensuring that every student reading Heart of Darkness also had to confront the African counter-perspective.
And it's important to clarify, Achebe never demanded the book be banned, did he?
No, never. His goal was always context, not censorship. He urged readers to read it with the kind of understanding and with the knowledge I talk about, and read it beside African works. He was demanding intellectual balance and complementarity in the syllabus, just as he demanded it in society. Moving into the last chapters of his life, Achebe faced these immense personal and political trials. Yet his influence only continued to grow, particularly in his capacity as a moral conscience for Nigeria and for the world.
After his retirement from the University of Nigeria in 1981, he attempted to re-engage directly with Nigerian politics, becoming active in the left-leaning People's Redemption Party.
This political re-engagement led to his influential nonfiction work, The Trouble with Nigeria, which was published in 1983 to coincide with the elections.
And what was his final sharp diagnosis of Nigeria's enduring problem in that book?
His argument, based on decades of observation, was that Nigeria's problem wasn't a matter of resources or external interference. It was internal. The issue was the unwillingness or inability of its leaders to rise to the responsibility and to the challenge of personal example.
It was a failure of leadership.
A failure of leadership, of corruption, and of moral imagination. He saw those as the central cancers holding the nation back.
Tragically, the elections that followed were marked by widespread fraud and violence. Did this experience just confirm his pessimistic assessment?
It absolutely did. Achebe quickly left party politics, expressing deep disappointment. He sadly noted that, if anything, the Nigerian politician has deteriorated since the days he had satirized them in The Man of the People, nearly 2 decades prior. After that, he maintained a strict intellectual distance from organized political parties.
Then came his final novel in 1987, Anthills of the Savannah, about a military coup in the fictional nation of Kangan. It was hailed as an essential and powerful antidote to cynical Western commentary. It was a Booker Prize finalist.
This intellectual peak was followed, tragically, by a life-altering event in 1990. He was riding in a car in Lagos, the axle collapsed, and the car flipped. The weight of the vehicle caused catastrophic damage to his spine,
leaving him paralyzed from the waist down and requiring a wheelchair for the remainder of his life.
A horrific accident that ended his ability to live full-time in Nigeria, but it did not end his influence.
Not at all. Following the crash, he moved permanently to the U.S. to access specialized care and continue his academic career. He held the Charles P. Stevenson Professor of Languages and Literature position at Bard College for over 15 years.
And later joined Brown University as Professor of Africana Studies. Even from afar, he continued to be this potent, critical voice in Nigerian politics, openly denouncing the usurpation of power by figures like General Sani Abacha.
His final years were marked by major international recognition. He won the Man Booker International Prize in 2007. And the citations from his contemporaries, they just show how profoundly he had changed the literary landscape.
Absolutely. The judging panel hailed him for having illuminated the path for writers around the world. Toni Morrison credited his work for sparking her love affair with African literature.
And perhaps most movingly, Nelson Mandela, reflecting on his time in prison, remarked that Achebe was a writer in whose company the prison walls fell down.
What an incredible tribute.
However, a notable aspect of his legacy involves the honors he refused, which speaks volumes about his commitment to principle. He declined the Nigerian government's Commander of the Federal Republic, or CFR, award twice.
In 2004 and again in 2011. This rejection was a profoundly courageous political act in a volatile environment. He cited his extreme frustration over the dangerous political environment and the lack of commitment from leaders to unite diverse peoples. By refusing a high national honor twice, he was explicitly stating that the moral state of the nation made accepting such a title an act of complicity.
He was saying the honor was meaningless until the country fixed itself.
Exactly. Until the reasons for his initial rejection, the violence, the corruption, the leadership failure were addressed, the honor was hollow.
And finally, the question that always hangs over him, the Nobel Prize. Despite his unparalleled global regard, he never won.
Achebe was famously indifferent, which again speaks to his commitment to an African-centric worldview. He viewed the Nobel as a European prize, not an African one. He summed it up with classic humility and a rejection of competition, noting that literature is not a heavyweight championship.
His validation came from his impact.
From his impact on his own people and on the generations of writers he inspired. That was what mattered.
He died on March 21st, 2013, and was buried in his hometown of Ogidi. But his community provided the ultimate, most fitting recognition after his death.
They did. He was posthumously created the Ugonabo, a Nigerian chieftain title, which is the highest honor a man may receive in Igbo culture. That honor, given by the culture he fought so hard to preserve and elevate, feels far more fitting than any purely European accolade could have been.
So what does this all mean for us? The sources show that Achebe's life was dedicated to this audacious mission: to simultaneously preserve the integrity of Igbo culture, leverage the English language for maximum global reach, and relentlessly challenge the ingrained racism and structural ignorance of the Western literary canon.
He didn't just write himself onto the global stage.
No, he became the indispensable center of a world that once chose to ignore him.
And the profound essence of Achebe, beyond his specific accomplishments, is captured in his core philosophical mission against the mortal sin of righteousness and extremism. His entire literary output, his political critique, his refusal of honors, it was all dedicated to finding that essential complementarity.
The necessity of accepting something, however small, from the other to make you whole.
Exactly. He taught us that intellectual certainty or cultural isolation leads only to personal and societal ruin. There must be balance.
And this brings us back to the heart of the original tragedy he wrote about. Chinua Achebe saw Okonkwo's ruin, the downfall of the great man and his community, as the price paid for offenses against the feminine principle, the failure to respect the necessary balance of Nneka.
So if the greatest literary tragedy of modern Africa can be traced to a lack of gender balance and respect for complementarity, what modern crises, whether political polarization, systemic corruption, or destructive conflict, are being fueled today by the failure to recognize the indispensable value of the other, or the strength and softness, the necessary balance that avoids extremism?
It's a question for all of us. Where in your own life, or in the systems you observe, might the price of imbalance be exacted? Where might you be paying the penalty for offenses against the feminine?
That is the enduring challenge Achebe leaves us with.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.